All right. Good evening, everyone. It's really great seeing so many smiling faces here in the store. I know some of y'all are wearing masks, but I still feel the smile through it. And then, of course, hello to everyone joining us by live stream. If you're interested in purchasing a signed copy of Immigration Matters, you can go ahead online to Eventbrite, and those will be on sale until 11 p.m. tonight. For those of you here in store, we've got them for you already. So you can either purchase them. At this point, you can purchase them towards the end of the program, and they'll be signing them as well. And yeah, my name is Lori Barrento Sanchez. I'm Director of Operations for Busboys and Poets Books. And tonight we are very, very, very lucky to have a lovely panel to not only speak to you guys about immigration, of course, and the state of affairs after a Trump presidency, after a decade of dreamers fighting and fighting and fighting, and nothing quite popping up real nicely. But we're also here to talk about where are we going, what is the future like, and what does hope look like within that frame. And so without further ado, I'm very, very excited to introduce you all to Deepak Bhargava, Cecilia Munoz, Ruth Milkman, and Lorela Praeli.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you to Busboys and Poets, and I guess I'll thank ourselves at Community Change for co-sponsoring this event. And thank you all for showing up and being with us in person. It's so good to see you, old and new faces, and for all of you tuning into the live stream, and of course, to Deepak, Cecilia, and Ruth. My name is Lorela Praeli. I am co-president of Community Change. And I have to say, it always feels special to be in space, especially with you, Deepak, to know and to feel the responsibility of being able to carry forward the legacy, your legacy, the organization that you helped to build and transform. And Dorian and I always feel very blessed to be in the roles that we are, to carry out this vision to build more power with and for low-income people. And so thank you for what you have pulled together in this book and for being in conversation with us today. Deepak is many, many things, including now an academic, but an organizer, former director, executive director of Community Change for 17 years. 16, I'm sorry, I've been saying 17 this whole time. There's a big difference there. And we also have here Cecilia Munoz, who is my sister. She's always on my panic, like emergency contact dial, especially in the middle of the fights that we find ourselves in. Cecilia did 20 years at NCLR, now called Milos US. She then went on to the White House and was domestic policy director of the Domestic Policy Council, and is now a senior advisor at New America. And we're going to be in deep conversation. And also to my right is Ruth Milkman, who's a sociologist of labor and labor movements at the Graduate Center at CUNY and the chair of labor studies, the Labor Studies Department at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. And I hope you're all getting ready to dig into her chapter in particular. Well, all chapters. Okay, gotta be fair here. And it feels really special to be in conversation, to be having the conversation we're going to have today, particularly because of the moment we are in. As the entire Build Back Better agenda begins to move, continues to move, with so much hanging on this particular piece of legislation for all Americans, including undocumented immigrants. With all of the fights, some of the losses of the last few weeks, I still believe that this is our moment. And so I want to start with you, Deepak. And I want to ask you, what was your motivation for this book?
Well, thank you, Lorela, first of all. I can't imagine a better successors than you and Dorian in the world. So it's an honor to be interviewed by you. And it's like to see friends and family from so many chapters in life. It's just really beautiful. Thank you so much for coming out. It means a lot to me. So the book was written in 2020 in the dark Trump era. And the idea was that we needed to move away from just opposing stuff and move to proposing an affirmative and bold vision for what immigration should be in this country. And under the radar screen, underneath all the noise and the controversy about immigration, both among academics and among activists, there were boldly visions being formed about what enforcement should look like, how we should respond to climate change and migration, how we should think about future migration, the role of immigrants in the economy, the border. And so we really wanted to lift up that positive vision and give it some airtime and lift up some leaders as we plan to transition. The other piece of the motivation is that nativism has really been the engine for right-wing politics in this country and really around the world. And so we wanted to lift up stories about how to build multiracial coalitions that could successfully take power, compete for power, lean into immigration as opposed to lean away from it. And I'm super excited about the stories in the book that speak to transformations of Nevada, California, bridge building across lines of race, alliances between immigrants, African Americans, working class whites. And so that's the inspiration of the book is how do we make immigration a central, positive, winning part of the rest of the country.
I want to stay with you for a second. 10 years ago, and I've been reflecting a lot since the beginning of this campaign on the Dream Act fight, December of 2010, when we couldn't get all of the Democrats. And Cecilia, I'm curious about your reflections on this as well. We couldn't get all of the Democrats on the Dream Act. And, Deepak, you write a lot about, and now the demand for citizenship is a given. And in your chapter, you reflect on, hold on a second, it wasn't always this way. It is mainstream politics now and mainstream policy, even though we've not yet won. But it's very hard to be a Democrat today and not be for citizenship and for legalizing 11 million people. And that was just not the case 10 years ago. Now, we have shifted the Overton window, as you described, Deepak, in your book. What do you think made that possible? And Cecilia, I'd also love your take on this.
Well, I can make a little confession about this. The late 90s, to date myself, when I came up, was a very conservative era, right? It was the era of welfare reform, crime bill, very partially cured immigration bill that was supported by Democrats as well as Republicans. And so I remember when I came to community change and I went out working to communities around the country to listen, I would hear about the issue of, if you want to address poverty in America, you actually have to address immigration. And there's a rule in organizing, the first time you hear something, you ignore it, and I did. But the 10th time I heard it, I was like, actually, they're right. And at that point, it was very outside the mainstream of political discourse. And it's really such a case of a big, broad social movement, mainstreaming an idea. We called it amnesty at the time, went through some rebranding over the years, right? It's the Baptist Institute now, it's the same idea. How a social movement forces it into the equation and into the political discourse. And to me, one of the crucial ingredients of that is building broad agreements in civil society. And the book really talks about that. The faith community, organized labor played an essential and indispensable role in moving the discourse. Community organizations. And then I think the other dimension was electoral politics. The argument that this is the future of the electorate. It's either get right with it, or you're going to be in trouble. So it was a long battle to mainstream the idea, but it's now something that Democrats can't at least have to salute the flag to say that they're for. So that's a huge accomplishment for the movement.
The one thing I would add to that, and starting with my thanks to you, Lorella, and to you too, and to all of you for being here, is that it has to be said that part of the way that the Dream Act and the notion of a path to citizenship got mainstream was because people were really courageous and told their stories. I've been at this long enough to have gone from having to, anytime I spoke in a public setting, they have to describe what the DREAM Act was and explain it at length and in very careful terms, and now I don't have to do that anymore. Like, none of us have to do it. The whole country knows what this is. And that was the result of not just tremendous organizing work, as Steve points out, but also actually tremendous courage. Like the courage that it took for folks and takes for folks to share their stories has resulted in the fact that people in the general public know who dreamers are in general and very often know someone who would be affected by this. And that's an enormous, enormous change. And it makes it very personal.
Thank you both. Ruth, I want to turn to you, actually following on some of the things Deepak said here, because in your chapter, you offer the important point that the economic struggles of U.S. foreign workers are not caused by immigration, even though a lot of people in politics would like us to believe that. But really by deunionization, deregulation, subcontracting, and skyrocketing inequality. And also Maynege's chapter in the book supplements yours with some history on the origins of nativism. Can you expand on your thesis here and its implications, what the implications are for our fights today?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for emceeing your dream, obviously. Let me just back up just a little and give the view from 30,000 feet up. And this is more about the book as a whole, too. One of the goals is to sort of, debunk some of the myths about immigration. So my chapter does that, May's does that, but also the overall frame and the introduction to the book does some of that. So, people have, they may know about the DREAM Act, but most people think that the majority of immigrants, the vast majority, are undocumented. That's not the case. Most people think all immigrants are Latinx, or they wouldn't use that word, but that's what they think, etc. Very few people are aware, for example, that that immigrants from Africa are the most educated part of the immigrant population and more educated on the average than U.S. foreign folks. So there's all that too. And so that was part of our mission, I guess, as the kind of research queen here. And I was very committed to making sure that was all I knew. So then to answer your question. So my own chapter challenges what I and some others call the immigrant threat narrative, the idea that, the white working class, which has experienced tremendous reversals of fortune in recent decades, that their plight is caused by immigration. So that was Trump's line, as you all know and remember, I'm sure. And it wasn't just Trump, it starts way before Trump. This is a narrative that has been promoted very heavily by the right wing for decades. Trump just sort of made it the centerpiece of his own politics. So by looking at history in the chapter in this book that I wrote, I try to show that this is backwards. That actually the plight of the U.S. working class is not a consequence of immigration, but actually the causality goes in the other direction. Let me explain. So, as we all know, in the period since the late 1970s, employers, as Mel already mentioned, have systematically gone about squeezing labor, and especially for non-college educated workers. So they've gone on a rampage against unions very successfully. They've promoted deregulatory policies that undermine unions and lead to reduced wages. They've taken away pensions, conventional pensions from many, many workers in the private sector. The list goes on. Healthcare benefits have deteriorated. We all know all this. Okay, so, and that has disproportionately affected US-born, non-college educated workers. But, and what I try to show in the chapter, and I've also written a short book that elaborates it further if anybody's interested, but that the sequence of events is this. Take an industry like residential construction. Employers go about doing that. They attack the unions, they cut pay, the benefits disappear, etc. And a lot of and this was an industry that was highly unionized in the past.
workers earned so-called middle-class incomes, they had Cadillac benefits, all of that. That goes away actually it starts pretty early in the Vietnam War years and then continues especially in the 80s. A lot of those workers say, I'm not doing this job anymore, not on these terms, and they move on. And when that industry, a lot of them could move into commercial construction, which remained better paid and unionized. And this happened in a lot of other industries too. Trucking is another one. And there are more, but those are just two examples. And then employers need someone to do the work. The people they originally hired aren't interested anymore, and they hire immigrants. So who are then exploited, as we all know, and victims of wage theft and all the rest of it. So the causality goes the other way. The U.S.-born white workers have every reason to be enraged about their situation, but they shouldn't be directing their rage at immigrants, rather at employers, and also, well, there's more policymakers who've promoted all these changes as well. So that's the short version. Let me just say a word about May 9's chapter, since you asked about it. That's the other kind of historical chapter in the book. May 9 is a historian at Columbia, and some of you may know her fabulous book, Impossible Subjects, which is a history of immigration in the 20th century. But in this chapter, she takes on something a little different, which is another myth-busting exercise. So many people think that that nativism surges in periods of economic decline. She argues, but that's not the case, that in fact, nativism is associated with periods of economic change and growth and turmoil. So, like the period we're living in, right? And she documents that going back 150 years. So you can read, that's just a teaser, you can read all the details in the book, but anyway. So that's one big theme for us is myths versus facts.
Yeah, and I appreciate you erasing it. I have to say she's not here right now, but when I was an undocumented student in college, I found like her book just gave me so much. Like I think about myself in the library at Quinnipiac University, just poring over her book and trying to make meaning of my life as an undocumented person. So I carry her with me. Cecilia, there's a lot that's been happening at the border. It seems to be that way often. Can you describe the border paradigm that you offer in your chapter, and how current events either confirm or disprove what you wrote? How can the Biden administration break out of the current frame where they clearly feel like they have no option, but to deliver a message of deterrence and to maintain Title 42, even as they take heat from many of the advocates in this room, ourselves included, who are disappointed with this approach? And then I have a follow-up to that as well.
So as you heard, we wrote the book in last year before the election. The border was an issue then. We anticipated that the border might be an issue this year, and of course it is. Like I wish to God this weren't as relevant as it is, but it's obviously very relevant. And we think of the border as this intractable problem. Sort of our political class thinks of it as an intractable problem and as a headache for whoever's in power to address. And it has been, but it's not an intractable problem. There are solutions here. But the first thing to remember is that what's happening at the border really is the result of a refugee crisis in our hemisphere. And the longer we think of it as a border problem to be solved with solutions that are available at the border, the greater the likelihood that we're going to fail in addressing it. So the thing that the Biden administration is doing, which is tremendously important, and frankly I would argue they need to do more of, is actually engaging in the region, not just in the Northern Triangle, but clearly we need to be engaged differently and in Haiti and in other places, right? That we're part of a hemisphere, and our foreign policy focus is on other parts of the world. And then we, wake up and think, why is it that we have a problem at the border? Our engagement in our own hemisphere needs to be very, very different than it is. So, and that's not a short-term solution, but it is essential. You cannot fix a refugee crisis at the border. You can, however, do much better than we do at the border. But the other thing to recognize is that every bit of the infrastructure that's available at the border, from the laws and policies, but also the whole physical infrastructure, the literal facilities, like the places, the buildings where the Border Patrol sits, the other facilities that are kind of relevant to this process, were all built for the border we had 30 years ago, when the major challenge was single adults coming from Mexico. And not for the border we have today, where the main challenge is families coming from Central America, now coming from Haiti and from other places. We don't have infrastructure for that. Our personnel don't have training for that. We don't have facilities that are proper facilities to house and hold people with children. And so all of that needs to shift. That's not easily done. That requires a little cooperation from Congress, which is not going to be forthcoming. But that's just important to recognize. Like I say this as a former government official, the tools available to the government in addressing the border really suck. They're just terrible. And that's the tools that the administration has to work with. But there are also, I think it's tremendously important to understand that there are policy approaches here that are actually effective. They require some courage to put into place. And I think the model to work towards, and to their credit, the Biden administration is taking some baby steps in this direction, and I'm hopeful that they will take more, it has to do with how we treat people who are asking for protection, right? Some number of the people who are approaching us at the border are going to qualify for asylum, some number are not, right? The government's job is to sort out who is who. We need probably much different standards for who we decide to protect. But we can even do a better job of applying the standards that are available under the law right now. The key is to recognize that people are going to come and ask for help, to recognize that there are people who have endured trauma and to treat them accordingly. And frankly, house them properly, humanely, in a community setting that is entirely doable, and get them an answer on their asylum petition expeditiously, quickly. Right now, if you ask for asylum, you might not get a hearing for 5 years. That is a disservice to like all kinds of players in the system. It is possible to recognize that we're going to have this challenge, to treat people decently, get them a true, faithful, thoughtful answer. And for the folks who get to yes, they can continue with their lives and they can do that expeditiously. And for the folks who are not going to get to yes, to have a much more humane mechanism of return, which is part of how the system works. Like, we can do all of that much better than we do, but it takes resources, it takes commitment, it takes intentionality. And right now, we just think of this as a short-term crisis that we have to manage, and that's the wrong mindset.
There's so much I feel like I could dig into here. I think a lot about your chapter, Deepak, and sort of this call for more migration. And maybe even for changing some of the standards or the basis for, what qualifies you as an asylee in the United States. But I've also been thinking a lot when I read your chapter, reread your chapter, Cecilia, about this other book called The End of the Myth. And just the sort of the role and sort of the psychological role that the border has played in the history of the United States. That also connects to your chapter, Ruth, in a different way, in that it's almost helped to distract people. Sort of like this idea of pushing out the frontier forever, but also of, like, if you can concentrate the focus at the border, and you can blame immigrants in the interior for why why our economics are not set up to work for working people and for most Americans, it serves a political purpose for Republicans. And so, I'm reflecting on your chapter, Cecilia, and some of your comments, and this idea that in order to have good policy outcomes, you have to have control of the border. And the one thing I wrestle with, because I agree on there are policy options, our laws are dated. We also have a Congress and Republicans who have, for whom it is in their political interest for this to remain unresolved. And so how do we make, what do we make of that as we think about the need to change laws and the need to address the undocumented population inside of the United States? Like, when do we get to check the box And is it ever enough, actually, or are we having the wrong conversation? Or maybe the answer is you can have a broad conversation, to your point, Deepak, where there's a centrist and liberal perspective and also a leftist perspective. So I'd love your take on that.
So this is such a good question, and we could be here all night, and I promise not to make this a long answer. I think a lot of this has to do with the frame in which we have the conversation. The frame the Republicans want, the one that works for them, is who is tough and who is not tough, right? And if we're having that conversation, Democrats can't succeed, which is why that's the conversation they want to have. It's like the perfect crime. They get to prevent anything from happening that could actually resolve the situation and then complain about how broken it is, and use that to their political advantage. The frame that works and has worked for Democrats is to move it to a logical, workable system, being the people who can fix a thing that's broken, and framing the Republicans as the people who are invested in brokenness, right? And that means that we have to be willing to say, we can make this orderly. And if, I firmly believe, if you can convince the American people that you can make it orderly, that they are also willing to be generous, that you can expand who gets to come in, as long as you can convince people, yes, and they will come in with inspection, we'll get a chance to talk to people, make sure they don't have COVID or whatever it is, and we can succeed and help them succeed, and the rest of us will succeed too if we do this well. So having a conversation about fixing it and making sure it's orderly versus, continuing to complain and investing in its brokenness is the frame we need to have.
All right, and I see Jess here is taking notes on all of this, and she's gonna really fix all of this for us. Deepak, this is a good transition to you because one of the big themes of your book is the need for a new approach on the future of migration, really. What's the argument?
Yeah, so I have a job for you. Once you're done with getting a path to citizenship for millions of people, which I think we will do this year, believe it. What's the next task? And I think we need a movement in this country to admit millions more people legally to the United States. And I think it will be one of the great causes of this century. It will be like the anti-slavery movement in the United Kingdom. It will be like the movement for marriage equality. It will be like that. And here's why. Morally, we have a refugee crisis in this hemisphere. That crisis is going to get worse and worse. So climate change means that millions of people are going to flee their homes and seek refuge in the global north, in the United States. The countries of the global south did not cause climate change, but they're disproportionately the victims of it. So that's the moral case. The economic case is the country is aging. And the new census data shows that in a few decades, we'll have 2 workers for every retired person in the country. That's an unsustainable ratio. We will need to admit millions of more people. And I think there's a political case for it, which is that for Democrats especially, being Republican light is not going to work.
Can you just say that again, please?
Yeah. To be Republican light is not going to work. In other words, to have the same policies as the prior administration, but maybe a little less hard, without the horses, it's not going to work. It's going to be politically toxic. And I think there's a mass constituency to be built and mobilized, much as was built for legalization, for expanded immigration. So I call for a Statue of Liberty plan for the 21st century, right? We have this dark history about immigration, a dark racist history. But we also have moments of welcoming, of openness. It's part of our DNA too. We need to own that part too. And that is a history and tradition we can draw on. And so part of the book's call is we need to resolve the problems that are still with us about a path to citizenship and a broken system. And we need to open up a whole new debate for 21st century challenges. And we need to do it pretty quickly because they're at our doorstep.
Can I make a shameless plug that builds precisely what Deepak was just saying? So I helped co-launch a thing 2 weeks ago called welcome.us, which is planting a seed of building that movement that Deepak was just talking about, starting with the folks who are being resettled in the United States and Afghanistan. Because there will be tens of thousands of them, because there are new constituencies that don't think about immigrants and refugees, particularly veterans in the United States, who are eager to help with the process of helping our new Afghan neighbors resettle. And that this moment is as much about us as welcomers as it is about the needs of the people who are being resettled here. And so my hope is, it's a movement as well as a website, welcome.us, but that it creates a mechanism for regular folks to connect with people who are resettled in the United States. And the idea is to expand beyond this one group to the many others who are gonna need us and who we need to welcome, not just for them, but for us.
I think a lot about, when you say that, I think a lot about NILC's Immigrants Are Essential campaign, really recognizing people beyond their labor, their contributions, their economic contributions, but also, I mean, how many immigrants, like I'm an immigrant, Deepak, you're an immigrant, and I could ask people in this room, like we help to make this country. And I also think we have to claim it. We have to claim it and we have to reinterpret it, and we, you know, for many people who have tuned in and who are here, we believe it is our duty to criticize America, as James Baldwin would say, to love America enough to criticize her and to constantly try to or work to close the gap between the promise or the ideals and the current reality. And I think that's the power and the beauty of organizing. So I'm going to turn to you, Ruth, and ask, before I come to you on the 4 strategies, Deepak, and then I think we have Q&A also. A theme of the book really is the role of labor, community organizations, electoral politics, which Deepak talked a little bit about, in shaping the debate over the last decades. And what rays of hope did you find in that?
So the book includes 3 chapters that are actually interviews rather than essays. Everything else is an essay, with 3 very prominent figures in the recent history of immigration movements. So they are Eliseo Medina from SEIU. Those of you who follow all this stuff will remember he played a very big role, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. Dee Taylor, now the president of Unite Here, who comes out of the Culinary Workers Union, which is affiliated with that union in Nevada, representing restaurant and casino workers in Las Vegas and Reno. And Angelica Salas, who is more from the community organizing side of immigrant rights movement based in Los Angeles. So they're just 3 of many more, but that tell their stories in the book of how they got involved in this mission and how it changed over time. Let me just say a little bit about the labor piece, which is the part I know best, which is that the older people in the room may remember that back in the 20th century, remember that, organized labor was not embracing immigrant rights. In fact, some elements in the labor movement were actively anti-immigrant, saw immigrants as a threat in the way I was talking about before. In the year 2000, they do a 180-degree turn and come out with a statement supporting immigrants. I'm talking about the AFL-CIO. That's the year it happened, exactly, at the turn of the century. And that was based on some surprising to many in the labor movement, successful efforts to organize immigrant workers, which many people thought couldn't be done. But in the 90s, especially in the West Coast, but actually it spread around the country, the organized labor learned that immigrant workers were actually eager to unionize given the opportunity. They weren't given the opportunity all that often, by the way, but when they were extremely receptive and turned out to be more interested, more organizable in the inside baseball terminology than U.S. farm workers. And immigrant campaign, the iconic case is Justice for Janitors, which some of you are probably familiar with, which is important here in D.C. as well. But there were many others too, and Unite Here is another shining star in this story. So there you can see that there was a learning process where labor really changed its tune and joined the advocates for immigration. So, and then that has a whole political side to it as well. So first in California, and later elsewhere, I'll get to elsewhere in a second. The other thing that organized labor started figuring out was that if they helped ensure that naturalized immigrants, who were often members of these unions, to make sure that people who were eligible for naturalization became citizens, and then registered to vote, and then showed up to vote. So first in Los Angeles, actually, where I lived at the time, I sort of watched this close up. A guy who's no longer alive called Miguel Contreras was the head of the Central Labor Council in LA and kind of figured this out and went about systematically making all those things happen. And not only that, not just among union members, but the immigrant union members who were involved in this make sure that their neighbors and coworkers who might not be union members also went this route. And that built what, I guess he's not here, but many of you probably know Harold Meyerson, who's written a lot about this, who also used to live in LA at that time. That built what he calls the Labor Latino Coalition. And it transformed California's politics. We just saw it in action again with the attempted recall of Gavin Newsom, and it was the Latino vote that prevented that in the end. But this goes way back to the 90s. Following, it's actually a reaction to Prop 187, for those of you who know that history. Anyway, so California sort of led the way, but more recently, and this is the chapter by Dee Taylor in our book, this has happened in Nevada as well. Nevada has become a purple state and now a blue state through exactly the same process led by the culinary workers who represent 60,000 restaurant and casino workers in Las Vegas, and they did the same thing. They figured out that they could build that kind of coalition. So anyway, those are some of the experiences that we encountered, and that I think has led to the situation where the kind of coalition Deepak was talking about that we need to build to win this stuff more broadly. That's what makes it possible. So that's probably
Yeah, and there's also something about, I was talking to Christina Immigrant, who's one of my dearest friends, who's also in the book. You have to read her chapter, Immigrant Youth Organizing. And just thinking about, there is the political piece and changing the politics, and then there's also the role of organizing in people learning and owning their agency, right? When you think about the struggle and when you think about the timeline, when Christina came out, Christina did not identify as Christina Jimenez. A few years later, I came out and I was like, I am Lorella Prioli. Right? And I say that because there is so much that organizing makes possible, and sometimes we only think about the policy fight, but I think about the firm network, and for every firm leader, for every NDWA leader, is not only about the policy outcome, it is also about the transformation, moving from the individual to the collective. And I feel like we can have a whole other conversation about collective action. So before I do that, Deepak, I was gonna go through your 4 strategies, but actually just wanna turn to you and ask you, as we come to a part of the conversation where we get to do Q&A, what are those 4 strategies that you recommend in your chapter when we think about the way forward? And how do you see them in action in the coming year, 2 years? You've already alluded to some, but.
Yeah, we really talked about them a bit. So the fundamental thing is, the foundation, as you said, is really building mass organization among immigrants themselves. But the path to freedom for immigrants is going to rest on millions and millions of people being part of organizations. And I think it's an underappreciated story that when Community Change started working on this issue, there were 5 immigrant rights coalitions in the United States. There are now 40. Remarkable boom. Think about it. Labor organizing, et cetera. More and more people in organization. That's the foundation for all the reasons we said. Number 2 is alliances. A big theme of the book is that immigration has to be repositioned as part of a racial and economic justice agenda. Not as something separate off to the side, but fundamentally part of the racial and economic justice agenda. That's work the movement needs to do. That's really crucial work in this next century. And that implies a whole set of alliances with African Americans, with other people of color, with labor, etc. The third piece of work is politics. So from California to Nevada to the beginnings of Arizona to playing a role in Georgia, like the map is a crucial piece of the equation. And then the last part, which I want to echo what Cecilia said, is I think there's a deep hearts and minds issue, a culture change issue that's crucial to the win. And you played such a crucial role in this yourself. But I think the country is ready for an awakening because of the way the country is changing to immigrant stories being part of the fabric. And that hearts and minds process is indispensable to getting to a better place.
Yeah. Deepa, the curious thing about this sort of repositioning immigrants' rights or immigrant justice as part of the economic and racial justice agenda is that so many of the organizations already do that. It is actually just a gap in the national conversation. But I think about the Make the Roads, I think about the NWA chapters, I think about the Luchas of the world, and the United We Dreams, and community change, and sort of the list really goes on where already the work that people are doing and leading on the ground is not exclusively immigrants' rights or what you would consider immigrants' rights. And there's this understanding because of the people who are part of your membership that you're a human, you're a worker, you're a person, you're a worker, and all of these issues you're impacted by in action across the board, not just on legalization. And I think a deep appreciation that even if, when we do legalize millions of people, they're still going to be impacted by our housing policies, our economic policies, and our child care policy, and the list goes on, which is why I think that the moment that we're in as a country and the kind of conversation that we're having about, with the Build Back Better agenda and all that is riding on the moment that we, the big we, have helped to create. That, Biden is here and has presented this bold vision, and Cecilia, I have to say, you were instrumental. Leading the transitions team development of the domestic policy, we are now all rallying around and trying to get across the finish line, so thank you. And so there's just some catching up that I think needs to happen and some real deep work at the national and at every level, but really following the leadership of people who are already in practice and who really see immigrant justice and immigrants' rights as economic and racial justice issues.
Exactly, and the mindset change is really about understanding immigrants as, of course, affected by these economic and social policies, but also understanding immigrants as among the agents of change who are going to bring the victory on those policies,
Yes.
right?
Yes, could not have said it better. So I am very aware of the time, and I believe we opened it up for Q&A. So Lori, can you tell us how it is, please?
So I've turned on my handy mic. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Don't be shy. Not all at once.
Hello. So grateful to be here. Thank you so much for giving your thoughts. I am definitely inspired and I've learned so much from you. My question is, as a political science student at the George Washington University, I'm very well aware of the climate change that's going to happen, and I'm very well aware that we're going to have so much movement within our own country as well as outside of our own country. So my question is, what do you think we need to do to start preparing for that in a way that is equitable for people?
Yeah, I can take a start at it. So it's a great question, and most of the displacement that's happened so far in climate change is internal displacement, and most displacement in the future will actually be internal displacement. So there's a whole set of policies that have to do with housing and land use and resettlement and income that this country has yet to fully grapple with, making cities more resilient, et cetera. The immigration part of it is, one argument in the book is that we need to think about the workers. Sakatsoni has a really amazing chapter in the book that argues, who are the workers who are going to need to build an America that's resilient to climate change? And that will be African-American workers, white workers, immigrant workers too, helping to build a resilience force that can kind of make America ready for climate change. And then the migration part of it is, we don't recognize climate as a reason, for example, to get asylum or humanitarian claim. We might need to think about new category for people to come to the United States: climate refugees, climate migrants, a whole new category. A significant portion of the number of people who came from the Northern Triangle were displaced by hurricanes, floods, droughts, etc. That's going to escalate over time. So that's my immigration part of the solution.
I just want to add one point from Sakatsoni's chapter, which you should look at in the book. He points out that the people doing a lot of the work, starting with Katrina, more recently with Ida, where I live in New York, are overwhelmingly foreign-born workers who actually, he's documented this, who travel around from crisis to crisis. And he makes a case that this is a form of essential work that needs recognition, and that should be, another path to citizenship should be available to many of those folks are undocumented. So
Yeah, the resilience force.
this is the name of his organization.
Yeah.
So there's a plug.
I think you also had your hand up.
Sorry.
First of all, thank you for the four of you and for your incredible work. I feel like what Lorella is leading right now in Congress, with people like Jess, is a little bit the manifestation of what Deepak was saying, which is that the immigration debate, which had always been sort of a sidecar to so many things, now gets to be in the center with other issues, and it's kind of in other economic issues and social issues, and it's a remarkable thing, and it's the work of these people and many others that has gotten us here. So appreciated what you've done to get us here. As Deepak knows, though, I'm going to bring the doom a little bit. I
thought it was only Jeff Parcher's role.
Sorry, we hadn't gotten to Jeff's. Jeff's going to take us down a notch. I do feel like, to some of Cecilia's discussion, we are at actually a fragile moment in some ways, as much as we're on an arc up. I actually feel like there was a political high watermark that was a few years ago for us, and it's been a little bit unstable since. And I'm particularly concerned, so I feel like the mass movement work has been amazing. I won't talk about that one, I promise. I am concerned. I think that actually, Cecilia, to me, the narrative work is so much about the agency and the injustice of interior enforcement the last 20 years, and that shifting attitudes about that among people, that with the Dreamers being the iconic example, which is people who are here already, it's not fair how the system works, they're part of us as a society, we should let them stay. And that's been kind of the core drive. And I feel like this shift to, okay, people who aren't here, we need to welcome them. That's actually a major political shift in how we do our work, in the sense that it's not people self-advocating who are here, but it's actually the country saying we need this other thing. So I guess two things on that that I'm struggling with that I think are really critical. So one is this notion of welcoming, which I love. There is a rich history, especially in faith communities, and throughout even really hard times on these issues, of having faith communities, even in tough places, being welcoming places. And I love using the Afghanistan point of entry. I'd love to hear more about this notion of welcoming and how we get people to have a sense for that. The second is, and I say this comes from labor movement, I'm curious, different than the kind of the Central American Triangle issue, but as climate refugees come, are they going to come sometimes as more seasonal workers? And I say this as somebody who really struggled with that issue, which is sort of like how, you know, snowbirds move. In our country, we see more of that. And do we actually have to have a theory of the case around guest work that really breaks open? Like, as somebody who's fought against that concept in so many ways for so many years, do we have to reopen that and reframe that with a set of standards, justice, other notions around it? Not to say open borders, but to say more free flow, but free flow with real rigor and standards, and how we deal with both the politics of that and the human cost of it. So those are two things.
Two light questions, thank you.
Light questions.
Not easy stuff, Peter, but thank you for raising it. I mean, I think on the guest worker question, I fear the answer to your question is yes, this is something that we have to think about and put on the table, forcefully, with a sense of the sort of humanity and dignity of the work and the workers. Like, it can't be the old guest worker conversation. We have to completely tear apart that mold and model and rebuild it in order for it to be okay for this kind of approach to be on the table. Look, I think it is the folks on the right who argue for guest worker programs who, you know, it has to be said in some cases, are like really eager to have folks who are exploitable and, you know, and you don't necessarily have to pay a lot. But their argument is that, and the compelling part of their argument is, people should get to choose what they want to do. We shouldn't force everybody into a migration path to citizenship model if that's not necessarily appropriate to their circumstances or their desires. And the agency thing is the one thing I'm willing to lift from their argument. So that I do think we are at a time of having to rethink some big things and some of the sort of long-term orthodoxies in our field to address what Deepak is talking about, because climate migration isn't like a thing that is coming. It's already here. And we're not equipped for it. And so I think you're right to be raising those questions, and I think we as a field and a movement have to reckon with that stuff. But putting what we have learned about how to frame these issues and frame what workers need first.
Just to add why the welcoming piece is so important, you know, borders are closed all around the world, right? This is not a US issue, the rise of nativism. There is one notable exception, which is the German exception. So Germany welcomed over 1 million migrants from Syria, and there were predictions. You may remember President Trump said this is the end of Germany, it's going to be a catastrophe, etc. Quite the contrary, over half of the German people participated in some way in helping to welcome Syrian migrants. Right? It wasn't just a government job, it was a whole society job. So this is why I think this welcoming piece is a civic project of renewal is so fundamental to getting it right. And that also has made it possible for it to be good politics. So in the latest German election, the 2 pro-immigrant parties, the 3 pro-immigrant parties got the highest share of the vote. The nativist right-wing fascist party didn't. And that's further evidence to me that leaning into the issue as opposed to avoiding it or trying to copy the nativists is a political winner too. But it really rests on mass engagement, civic society participation of welcome immigrants. The last thing to say about this is we really do have to reckon, this is the hard part to say, you have to reckon with the United States' role in being a causer of migration. US foreign policy, US economic policy. It's hard to understand the case of Haiti in particular without understanding centuries of intervention, of promoting exploitation. So, you know, the line I've been using recently is if you burn someone's house down and then they approach your door seeking refuge and you abuse them and turn them away, most of us would think that was crazy behavior, despicable behavior. That is, in fact, our policy. So that's going to be a hard idea to socialize, I recognize. But it is the reality underlying why thousands of Asians are turning up at the Mexico border. We need to have that conversation with real wins.
I just want to add one other point in response to Peter's very provocative questions, which is that I think for too long, we've been avoiding those kind of questions. Like, we're focused quite rightly on, the DREAM Act or the equivalent, a path to citizenship for 11 million people, all of that, which is necessary, but it's kind of too easy. We do need to think about, what if we were running the show? How would we handle the border? How would we handle the potential guest worker thing? And in a way, that's one of the big goals of the book, is to try to open some of that up and to encourage us not to just react to what the right does, but to really think through, what is a humane, progressive immigration policy? And it includes welcoming more people, which you can actually make a very solid, quote unquote, business case for. I mean, it's good for the United States, but it's more than that. It's good for our politics, as the German example that Deepak just laid out suggests, and it's the right thing to do on just human moral terms. And so I feel like we haven't gone there enough, as it's all about 11 million people, and everyone, and the public is with us on that now. That doesn't mean we're going to get it this year, but I hope you're right about that.
No, I think it's time to change the conversation. And win or lose, even though I believe that we are going to win still, I do feel like we have to break out of the way in which we've held and led the conversation. And we have to have the kind of vision, like the North Star and the driver, in the same way that, I hate saying his name, but in the same way that Stephen Miller did. I mean, like your chapter, Deepak, and he was really about white nativism. What is that? What's at the heart of what is driving our vision, our policy agenda, our narrative change and culture change work, our organizing, our theories of change. And so I do think that we're ready for that conversation, and it's also time. And it's going to be a leap for a lot of the elected officials, because I think in a lot of ways they've gotten very comfortable with, yeah, of course I am for a pathway to citizenship, and that's been our work. And now it's like, okay, now you have to take the next, now you've got to move into, we are in a different global context. There is obviously our history and owning our past and our role in sort of what we're sitting with today. And then there's also just what we already know in the conversations we're having in other parts of the progressive and racial and economic justice movement about what is to come and how we prepare for that. Are there any other questions from the audience? Lori will bring you the mic. I have one that came in, so I want to ask you all this, and it feels very, very timely given what's happened and happening at the border with Haitian immigrants. There's the link to the racial justice piece. So the question is, if we are to align with the racial justice movement, do we not need to address the use of the criminal system to funnel disproportionately Black immigrants into the deportation pipeline? How does that fit into the conversation that we're having?
I'll start. I mean, one was an incredibly important point, and so the answer to that is yes. I think one frustration that I have about the conversation about enforcement is that we are being forced to spend so much time and energy on what happens in the enforcement context as a result of Congress failing to do the thing which 85% of the public is for, which is moving millions of people onto the legal side of the equation so that enforcement is not even an issue, right? So that's, we still are having to fight and wrestle over the results of Congress's failure to act. And I firmly believe that there is an opportunity, if we can succeed in this legalization work that you were so deeply involved in and leading, Lorella, that also creates an opening to just completely rethink what enforcement actually looks like and how it needs to take place. it's like we're stuck in this era, and have been for so long, that we almost can't think any other way. And there's no reason that has to be true. Like, it is possible to re-envision how all of this works in the context of letting more people in, right? You let more people in legally, then you don't have to worry about the enforcement piece. And if more people are, if you're able to legalize people, it just becomes a whole other equation, and you have an opportunity to rethink it.
Yeah, there's an amazing chapter in the book by Peter Markowitz that really asks some deep questions about enforcement. Why do we have basically a system where the only penalty is deportation? Why are there no intermediate sanctions? Why do we have a system that seeks to enforce first rather than seek how people can gain legal status? Why do we spend so much money on immigration enforcement compared to almost any other kind of enforcement? Fair housing enforcement, civil rights enforcement, worker rights enforcement are dwarfed by the amount of money we spend on immigration enforcement. So that's, I think, a really strong case for a new paradigm on enforcement that will have much better racial justice outcomes. But the other piece of it is, I think we have to have a deep reckoning with what the buildup of the Homeland Security state since 9/11 has meant for all of us, not just immigrants. It has led to, we've created an entire bureaucracy whose job is to police, harass, and detain Black and brown Americans. The consequences of that for our culture are really profound. It's like a toxic stream that flows through it. And I think we have to ask whether that infrastructure now really needs to be dismantled. Permanently, fundamentally dismantled. It's done so much damage to our national psyche, to our culture. You know, there's a line, I think here, cruelty has consequences. It doesn't just have consequences for immigrants, where they bear the brunt of it. It has consequences for us. When we tolerate this, we are now complicit in a system that is barbaric. So I hope we'll have the courage to really open up the question of not just, withdrawing from Iraq, which is the right thing to do, but really withdrawing from the whole Afghanistan, withdrawing from the whole psychology that war on terror caused. We're still living there.
Okay, so it's 7:11, and I believe we were supposed to wrap up by 7. Laura, okay. But I would be remiss if I was sitting up. I had the chance to have the mic, and it didn't say. And folks who are on my team who are here know I am not cynical. I do really try to practice what Mariam Kaba calls, or when she says that hope is a discipline. And I'm also really grounded in a set of material facts about the moment that we're in, and I feel like I try to do both. I can live in sort of the tension of both our ideals and our vision and what we feel the power to accomplish. And I do feel like we have built the power to deliver for millions of people this year. I don't say that lightly. I am not exaggerating about the moment that we're in. We have taken some big losses in the last 2 weeks. We've lost green cards with the parliamentarian. And we're also suffering from arcane racist structures in Congress that lead to this kind of outcome. So I want to call on everyone who is here and who's tuned in to thank the people here for being co-strategists. And despite, Cecilia came out with a great op-ed in the Hill, you've not read it, in the last 2 weeks, basically calling on Democrats and President Biden to prepare to ignore the advice of the parliamentarian and to get green cards through the finish line this year. And so we are very committed to this process with the parliamentarian, and we're going back with some options. And we're also very, very clear that this is the year to get it done. And I'll say that here to make sure that we're on the record. We will be looking at every Democrat. And it simply will not be enough to say we tried. We really gave it our all. If they are not, willing to use their power and the tools at their disposal to get it done. And that will allow us to turn to the next chapter, and I feel like really enriched by the conversation that we had here today about really having our eyes looking at the future and really grappling and wrestling with the challenges and the opportunities that this moment presents for our movement. And like the big we movement, not only or exclusively the immigrant rights movement. So with that, I want to thank all of you for for deciding to write the book. You can buy a copy of the book right there, and I believe that it is signed. And to all of you really for standing in this fight and for quite literally paving the path that we now get to shape in this very moment.
And can we thank Gorilla for leading the fight?
I just get, thank you, Deepak. I will receive it. And I am really just a vehicle, one of many, many people who have led us to this moment and who are carrying this moment. And so I also just want to say there were a lot of people who took courageous action this week. Angelica Casales, who wrote a chapter in this book, got arrested yesterday in California. Becky Belcourt, who is the leader of NACASEC, led a beautiful, just emotionally powerful action earlier this week outside of the White House. They organized 51 people in her tradition to shake their heads. And Becky's like, I don't usually look this way, but I decided to shake my head. 51 people representing the 51 votes that we're going to need. And then 51 people did civil disobedience yesterday. Like, there's just a lot of different expressions of our power. And so thank you. And really, I will take that for everyone who said yes to this moment and is fighting a good fight.
I'm not gonna lie, give them a round of applause. Thank you, Lori. I know we just clapped the hell out of ourselves, but let's do it again because they're really doing the work out Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'm not on screen, but if you are tuning in on our live stream and want to purchase a signed copy, you most definitely can on Eventbrite until 11 p.m. Otherwise, we're going to say goodbye to our live stream, folks. Good night. And we're